As you've heard on Bridge City News, the Keystone XL pipeline will be moving forward thanks in large part to a $1.5 billion investment and a $6 billion loan by the province. To talk more about it is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, nice to hear some good news for a change during these volatile times of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Isn't that the truth? It was sort of an odd thing on Tuesday. The government made the announcement really early in the morning. I think the press release landed in reporters' inboxes at about 6 in the morning. And there was a press conference in the afternoon to sort of explain some of the details of this. But the gist of it is that the provincial government, is buying a $1.5 billion equity stake in the Keystone XL pipeline. That's the one that runs from Hardisty all the way down to Steel City, Nebraska. And on top of that, they're also putting up a $6 billion loan guarantee to TC Energy, which is building the project. The idea being that once the pandemic lifts, once things, are starting to return to normal, the energy industry will be able to hit the ground running, start exporting oil, and get it down to Nebraska, where it can then go on to the refineries in the Gulf Coast for export.
Now, there's some risks, however, as TC Energy's credit rating was downgraded.
Yeah, so some analysts are sort of concerned that this might not get done. People who've watched this for a long time will remember, but that there's been just after lawsuit after lawsuit in the courts in the states, all the way down the pipeline route. So there is still a risk it won't get built. And the other sort of unknown risk at the moment is what happens if Donald Trump loses the election in November. Many Canadians not huge fans of the US president, but he has been in favor of Keystone XL in a way that Barack Obama was not. Now, Joe Biden, obviously the potential candidate to be the Democrats' candidate for president, he hasn't sort of said either way, but there is some concern, of course, that since he was Obama's vice president, he might also not be in favor of this. So the idea is to maybe get things going as soon as possible here.
Now, close to 20,000 education support workers have been laid off, speaking of huge, as a result of spending constraints during the pandemic since schools are out. Now, the cuts were recently announced and slammed by the opposition, Tyler.
Yeah, that's right. So this announcement happened on a Saturday. Government makes announcements on a Saturday, but I think it got some hackles up. Reporters saying, "Oh, this was a bit sneaky to release this on a weekend. Why didn't you do it during the week when everyone was around?" But that's basically it. So this affects educational support workers, as you said. So we're talking janitors, assistants, bus drivers, things like that. So the education minister says that they will all be hired back once this is done, but that money that was going to pay them to work for the rest of the year needs to go elsewhere in these sort of trying times. Now, of course, taking in what we just talked about with Keystone XL, the opposition goes, well, you've got $1.5 billion for Keystone XL, you've got $6 billion in loan guarantees. So why don't you have the money for these support workers? So there's been, some hot words exchanged. It's been a rambunctious couple days in the legislature, actually, where legislators have been at work, actually.
Now, there's some help for renters coming up in Alberta during this pandemic, thanks to a new bill which was passed. Tell me more about that.
That's right. So the government has a sort of small suite of bills we can talk about, and one of them basically prevents evictions and rent hikes during the pandemic. So for people, April 1st would have been the day that rent was due. For those that were unable to pay, they can't be evicted for that. Now, there are still provisions that exist to allow evictions for people who are landlords who have criminal tenant say or something like that. But the idea being that in addition to having this public health crisis, in addition to having a growing employment crisis, the government also does not want there to be a housing crisis. Now, this does, at this point, affect only residential tenants. So the NDP is saying that, look, you're going to have to do something about commercial tenants at some point. Those details may be yet to come, but thus far, it has been residential. And the government announced this last week, and basically did it by a ministerial order, but said, look, we're going to go to the legislature, we're going to pass legislation. These changes that we are making in these bills should go to the people who represent Albertans for approval.
Tyler, another bill is giving police and peace officers powers to enforce public health orders. Now, are we talking about those $1,000 fines, or could people potentially be arrested?
Well, it's a good question. And at this point, it seems from what I've seen that they're not going to be, arresting people who are having a picnic in a public park, but they could be fined. So, what this change does is, again, the minister last week sort of changed these things by regulation so that peace officers and police could enforce these public health rules. This is, again, just sort of bringing it to legislators to ask them whether or not they can be whether or not they approve of these changes. Obviously, there's civil liberties implications and things like that. So, what it basically means when Jason Kenney was asked about it was this is going to be if you've got a large assembly in a park, if you have things like that where police or peace officers might need to go over and say, you guys, look, we're in the middle of a pandemic, for goodness sake, clear out. So it's just sort of codifying changes that were already being made and that are going to allow law enforcement to sort of directly enforce these things. Now, the fines, of course, can be larger for really egregious violations of public health orders. Maybe if I don't know, if there's a rally or something, or say a church congregation had a 1,200 person Easter service, those could merit harder and harsher fines. Or if a restaurant stayed open in a way it wasn't allowed, but it does create sort of this law enforcement structure to keep everyone safe.
Now, another bill, Bill 12, is giving the Orphan Well Association the power to continue with well cleanup during the recession. Tyler, this will help keep some Albertans working.
Yeah, that's right. So, there's not that many options and opportunities, I think, generally for governments to keep people working and directly put them to work. But this is one of them. So you do have lots of people that work on these well sites. And so there've been some concerns about energy industry stuff and whether or not, proper social distancing can be maintained and whatnot in camps and things like that. But the orphan wells thing specifically is to just it's to keep people working, as many people as possible. This is work that needs to be done anyways. Many bankrupt companies that have sort of left these things behind aren't going to be able to do it. So the government has an opportunity to sort of put money into this, allow it to keep going, and try and keep a few more people employed.
The War Room in Calgary has cut its funding from $30 million to just $2.84 million. The opposition was saying, a lot of that $30 million could have gone on to support other areas, including healthcare and education.
Yeah, that's right. So the War Room, which has had, I think it would be charitable to say, a bit of a rocky and rough ride the last few months. $30 million, I should say, per year was what they've been budgeted for. As you said, cut by like roughly 90% or something like that. And that money is, this is part of the larger thing where they're saying, look, there are areas that we need to tighten up, where we need to cut if we're going to be able to appropriately confront this pandemic. And so that's one of the things. So they're going to be, focusing on research and some of that sort of stuff. But their activities certainly are going to be scaled back for the future.
Many Albertans are booking off their summer holidays right now, but Tyler, they may face some challenges when it comes to our provincial parks. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so the Environment Minister, Jason Nixon, the other week said that they're closing provincial parks to vehicle traffic and they're closing staging areas. So my understanding of it is you can still get in. You just won't be able to drive up to the parking lot, unload your stuff, unload your dog, go for a walk or whatever. The idea being that these are areas where people can be close together, are unable to maintain the 2 meters of social distancing. So it's just, it's a big step. It's a draconian step. The government sort of fully admitted this, saying, this is not something we super want to be doing. But it is, there's only so many things I think that the government is able to lock down without, going totally far out and making sure everyone's locked in their homes. So we're just seeing incremental steps, I think, in more strict procedures. And so the provincial parks are one of them. The facilities, I believe, had already been shut down. National parks have done similar things where washrooms and huts are closed. So it certainly, as spring, not that spring's coming in Edmonton super quickly, but maybe you guys are getting luckier down there. As spring comes, opportunities are maybe a little more limited than we're used to.
And there's one really beautiful park down here, Provincial Park. It's called Riding on Stone Provincial Park. It has a lot of the Aboriginal ridings and just a beautiful trail, beautiful walk along the Milk River. Have you ever been there? It's spectacular.
I haven't. I got to get down there. I've got family in Lethbridge, so I should make a trip.
Yeah, this summer, absolutely. Just make sure to park on the outside because you can't bring it on the inside. Right?
Exactly.
Alberta's Health Minister Tyler Chandra received some backlash recently after he confronted a neighbor over a meme he didn't like. What happened there?
Yeah, so there was this whole little controversy in recent weeks involving Tyler Chandra's wife, who is a partner in a healthcare business. And so this sort of came up, and people were upset that there was a conflict of interest. And there was, lots of abuse tossed at her and tossed at him over this, saying, there's a conflict, blah, blah, blah. The ethics commissioner had cleared this. It was fine from that perspective. But his neighbor, who he said he'd known for a long time, posted a meme about him on Facebook. And Tyler Chandra went over and asked him to delete it. And it sounds like, words were exchanged. They were a little bit passionate. The NDP has been seizing on this in question period. There have been demands for Tyler Chandra to resign. The premier says, no, I have, full confidence in him. I'm standing behind him. He did say he feels that Tyler should, focus on his job, try and ignore what's going on online. But he said, any Albertan is going to defend their wife passionately against abuse. And that's sort of what was happening here.
Tyler, let's talk a bit about the politics behind the scenes right now between the UCP and the NDP, and especially with COVID-19. We all want to see our economy rebound. We want Albertans to be safe and healthy. Is there a more cohesive unit when it comes to Notley and Kenny, or is there even more division now? What are you seeing?
It's a great question. And the answer is a little bit of both, I think. So in terms of cooperation, you are seeing some things that have happened that are a result of not cooperation per se, but things where everyone agrees. So the NDP had been pushing for protections for renters against evictions and payments for quite some time, and then the UCP went and did it. And so you could say that's how an opposition is supposed to work. You could say that's the two of them working together. You did see a little bit of variety in reactions. Rachel Notley said, oh, they dragged their feet. They were slow at doing this. You had, I think it was Janice Irwin tweeted that it's great to see this being done. So, there's been a little bit of difference even within the NDP caucus in greeting this news. Now, on the other hand, in question period, you have had the NDP slamming them over the education cuts that we talked about a little bit earlier. You've had them slamming them over Tyler Chandra. And Jason Kenney actually said on Wednesday in question period, he said, look, you're the only opposition in the country that's politicizing this thing. And I'm not sure that's 100% true, but there's been a little bit of both. And I mean, from where I'm sitting, I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. I think lots is getting done. And even if there is some of this political noise, I'm inclined to think it's probably a good thing that the opposition is still, raising a stink when it can about stuff. I mean, I think you don't get good government at the end of the day if every single person in politics is just going to agree on something, So we'll see what attack ads and stuff end up coming out of this down the line, I think. But I would say that both parties are walking a reasonably good line together in the midst of this pandemic.
Let's go back to Premier Jason Kenney for just a moment. Has he made any mention or any hints about possibly diversifying our economy even more? Trying to separate from the Alberta energy sector? I mean, it's our bread and butter right now, but look at oil, it's at $20 a barrel.
Yeah, there hasn't been a whole lot of talk about that at the moment. There was some stuff, if we sort of cast our minds back to the budget. Has there been anything new? Not really. I mean, my sense right now is very much that this government is focused on plugging the holes where it can and getting money out to help people where it can while people wait for the federal money to come in. And so it seems to me it's trying to keep things from getting too much worse and then hoping that it's going to rebound a little bit. And I mean, I think I'd be putting words in the premier's mouth by saying this, but it does seem to me that the sense right now is that diversification is a little bit of a conversation for when things are maybe a little better than they are now.
I guess it's true. We're really in survival mode right now, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic,
exactly.
Right? Yeah,
exactly.
Alberta correspondent for the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Thanks a lot for your time, Tyler.
Thanks, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.